We're going to take a look at homeostasis in this lecture. All organ systems except for one, which is the reproductive system, work together to maintain homeostasis. The word homeostasis, homeo means the same, and stasis means to stay. And what's staying the same or remaining constant is the internal environment, the extracellular fluid that the cells are living in. So even though the external environment, so for example, maybe the temperature outside is really cold or maybe it's really hot, your internal body temperature needs to stay the same, so right around 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit or 37 degrees Celsius. Some other things internally that need to stay the same, things like the composition of your body fluids, so things like your sodium levels, glucose levels, the amount of water you have in your body, all of those things need to remain constant in order for your cells to stay alive. Homeostasis is not the same as equilibrium. So do not tell me on the test that if the body is at homeostasis, you're at equilibrium. If you're at equilibrium, that means you're dead. So homeostasis means that you've got a variable that's remaining constant, like your body temperature, but in order for your body temperature to stay constant, like at 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, you have to keep putting energy in to keep it constant. When you're at equilibrium, you're not putting any energy in. And so that would mean that you're dead. And so your body temperature would eventually become the same as room temperature. And so that would not be good. So what happens if homeostasis is not maintained? Well, you get sick, and if it gets bad enough, it actually will kill you. So the reason I've got this fish tank here is, let's imagine that the fish are your body cells, and let's say that the filter on the fish tank stops working. So the filter is like your kidneys. So it's there to remove the waste. And if the filter is no longer working, the waste starts to build up in the water, and that'll make the fish sick. And eventually, if you don't fix the filter, the fish will die. And the same thing happens with a patient who goes into kidney failure. The waste products start building up in their blood because the kidneys can't remove it. And then the person starts to get sick. And if they're not treated, then that eventually will kill them. So there's a lot of diseases that are caused because homeostasis is not maintained. A really good example of this is diabetes. So blood glucose is not maintained in the normal range, and it gets too high, and that causes all kinds of problems in the body and will make you sick. And if it's not corrected, then it eventually will kill the person. So it's really important to maintain homeostasis and regulate it. And there are several ways that the body will regulate homeostasis. So the most common way is through negative feedback. Occasionally the body will use positive feedback, and there are some instances where the body will use feed-forward regulation, where the body is anticipating a change. So let's take a look at negative feedback first, because that's what the body usually uses to maintain homeostasis. And what happens in negative feedback is when you start to get out of the normal range, negative feedback will kick in and act in the opposite direction of whatever way you were going to bring the regulated variable back to the normal range. So for example, if your body temperature, if you were getting too hot, you would start to sweat and bring it back to the normal range. And if you were getting too cold, you would shiver and bring it back up to the normal range. So you're just going to go in the opposite direction of whichever way you were going to get back to the normal range. I like to think of negative feedback as if you're driving down the middle of the road, trying to keep the yellow line right in the middle. You obviously would not do that for real, but just, bear with me with this example here. And if you started to drift off the road and started to maybe shift to the left, negative feedback would kick in, and then you would go back to the middle of the road here to the yellow line. And if you started to drift off to the right, negative feedback would kick in and you'd go back to the middle again. So that's what negative feedback is. So a couple of terms that we use with homeostasis and negative feedback. We talk about the regulative variables. So that's just whatever your body is regulating. It could be blood glucose, maybe it's blood pH, maybe it's the concentration of sodium ions. It could be a lot of different things. The set point, they call it a point, but oftentimes it's a range. Some people call this the normal range. So for example, like your body temperature, the normal range or set point is this range here, and then here's for blood glucose. Here's the set point or normal range for that. And then the error signal is just the difference between the actual value of the regulative variable and whatever the set point of the normal range is. So maybe your body temperature is at 102 degrees Fahrenheit, and maybe the set point is 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. So that would give you an error signal. It says, hey, you're out of the set point or the normal range. So here's an example of negative feedback with blood glucose. So here we've got our set point here. And again, it would be a range, although they're just showing you one straight line here. But let's say that we've got our normal blood glucose sitting here around 100, and we're okay with that. But then we eat a meal, and our blood glucose rises, and now we're above the set point or normal range, and so now we're going to get an error signal, and the body realizes that, hey, we're out of homeostasis, and so negative feedback mechanisms are going to kick in, and we're going to bring the blood glucose back down to the set point again, and then we'll be back to normal. So there's a couple of components to a negative feedback loop. We're going to go through and talk about the sensors or receptors, the integrating center, the effectors, and the signals. So the sensors or receptors, they're going to be monitoring that regulated variable and watching what it's doing. So most sensors or receptors, the cell type that they're going to be made out of, most of them are going to be neurons. And they're going to send signals to the integrating center and say, hey, this is what the body temperature is. Or, this is what the blood pH is right now, or this is what the blood pressure is. Okay, and then the integrating center is going to take a look at, what's the blood pressure right now and what should it be? What is the normal range or the set point, and what is it right now? Is it in the normal range, or are we too high, too low, and do we need to do something to fix it? So the integrating center is usually going to be neurons in the brain or an endocrine gland. And that makes sense because remember the two organ systems that are in charge of maintaining homeostasis are the nervous system and the endocrine system. So it makes sense that the integrating center would be one of these two. Okay, the effectors, these are going to produce a response, and they're going to be responsible for getting that regulated variable back to the normal range. And so they're going to be usually muscles or glands. And then the signals that are going to be used to tell everybody what to do and talk to everybody are going to be either nerve signals or hormones. So let's take a look at a couple of examples of negative feedback loops. So here's for blood glucose. So let's say that you just ate a meal and our blood glucose is now too high. And so our sensor and integrating center in this case is actually the same cells. So these are the beta cells in the pancreas. And they sense that, hey, the blood glucose is too high. And they will send out a signal, which happens to be insulin, the hormone. And the insulin will tell cells throughout the body that, hey, there's lots of blood glucose out there, start taking that in. And that will lower the blood glucose and get it back to the set point or the normal range, and then we're back to normal. Okay, let's do another example of another negative feedback loop. Let's take a look at thermoregulation, so regulating the body temperature. So the regulated variable obviously is going to be the body temperature. And our set point, I know there's a range, but I can never remember it. But let's just put our 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit or 37 degrees Celsius. And the sensors, remember that most of the sensors are receptors. Most of them are going to be neurons. And they are actually called thermoreceptors. So these are just sensory neurons that are going to detect the body temperature, and they're actually going to be located deep in the core of the body, so in the abdominal chest cavity and the spinal cord, and also in the hypothalamus. So they're pretty deep in the body, and they're going to be telling the integrating center, hey, this is what the body temperature is right now. The integrating center is the hypothalamus, which is in the brain. And remember, the integrating center is usually going to be in the brain or an endocrine gland. So here we've got part of the brain. And the hypothalamus, the integrating center, will look at the incoming information from the thermoreceptors and decide, hey, is the body temperature normal? Is it too high, too low? Do we need to fix it? Or are we okay? Okay, and let's say that the body temperature is too high. Let's say we're hyperthermic. Okay, so hyper meaning excessive or more than, so your body temperature is too high. So if you're too hot, your effectors are going to be your glands and muscles. So obviously you're going to start sweating with your sweat glands. That'll cool you off. And then the smooth muscle around the blood vessels in your skin will relax, and that'll dilate the blood vessels in your skin and bring more blood to the surface of your skin, and so then you can dump off more body heat, and that will also cool you down as well. And then if you're hypothermic, hypo meaning less than, so that would mean you're too cold. So again, the effectors to get the body temperature to go back up to normal range would be your muscles and glands. So you're going to start shivering. So skeletal muscle will start to contract. That'll generate some body heat. And then also we're going to constrict the blood vessels, that smooth muscle around the blood vessels in the skin, to make sure that we don't get any blood going to the skin, because we don't want to lose any body heat through the skin. Okay, and then positive feedback loops. These are not used very often by the body, just in a few instances. And positive feedback loops are the opposite of what happens in a negative feedback loop. So remember, a negative feedback loop, the response is going to go in the opposite direction of the change, but in a positive feedback loop, you start to get away from the normal range, and the positive feedback loop kicks in and it pushes you even further away from normal. Okay, so that's positive feedback. Now there's always going to be some way to turn off a positive feedback loop, because you don't want to keep going further and further away from normal, because then you get way out of homeostasis and then you're in big trouble. Okay, but the reason you use positive feedback loop is that you want some sort of rapid change in the body, and then once you get that change, then you turn it off. Okay, a good example of positive feedback loop that everyone's experienced is sneezing. Okay, so you get that tickle in your nose and it gets worse and worse. Okay, that's positive feedback making it worse and worse. It tickles more and more. And then you sneeze, and you sneeze out whatever was irritating your nose, and that turns off the positive feedback loop. Okay, and then you stop sneezing. Blood clotting we'll talk about later, because you want your blood to clot quickly so then you don't lose a lot of blood. That's positive feedback. Childbirth is another example of positive feedback. So when the baby is being born, the baby's head will push on the cervix, and that will stretch the cervix. That will send a signal up to the posterior pituitary in the brain. Posterior pituitary will release the hormone oxytocin. Oxytocin will go to the uterus and tell the uterus to contract. And then the uterine contractions will push the baby further down into the cervix and stretch it more. And then the cervix will send another signal up to the posterior pituitary, release more oxytocin. You get stronger uterine contractions, push the baby further down and stretch the cervix more oxytocin, stronger uterine contractions. And so you can see how you get more and more oxytocin, stronger uterine contractions. But we're going to turn this off when the baby's born, because once the baby is delivered, the baby is out of the birth canal, no longer stretching the cervix, and so that stops that signal. You no longer send the signal to release oxytocin, and that stops the uterine contractions. Okay, here's another example of a positive feedback loop we're going to talk about later, the LH surge. So LH is a hormone, luteinizing hormone, released by the anterior pituitary, and that will tell the ovaries to secrete estrogen, and then estrogen will go back to the anterior pituitary and tell it to release more LH, which tells the ovaries to release more estrogen, which then goes back to the anterior pituitary to release more LH, and we keep going. So here's what it looks like. So we've got our level of LH, which is in the normal range, but then here in about the middle of the menstrual cycle, the LH levels start to go up. If this was under negative feedback control, negative feedback would bring the LH levels back to the normal range, and then we'd be back here. But positive feedback pushes the LH levels further and further away from normal. Okay, so this is under positive feedback control. And what the LH surge causes is it causes the ovaries to ovulate. So it causes the ovary to release the egg. And that's what turns off the positive feedback loop, because once the ovary releases the egg, it no longer responds to the estrogen and the LH as much, and that shuts off the positive feedback loop. Okay, and another example of a positive feedback loop is in neurons when they generate a nerve signal. We end up letting in sodium ions, and when you let in sodium ions, the inside of the neuron becomes more positive, and that triggers more sodium to come in, which makes it even more positive inside the neuron, which lets more sodium come in. And so you can see that we're getting further away from the normal down here, okay, which normally it's minus 70 millivolts inside the neuron. And we'll learn about this later. Okay, but notice how we're going further and further away from the normal range. Okay, so positive feedback is pushing us further away from normal, and so generating this action potential, this nerve signal, that's another example of positive feedback. Okay, and then one last way to regulate homeostasis is called feed-forward regulation. And this is interesting because the body is anticipating a change in the regulated variable. So nothing has changed yet, but the body says, I know it's going to change, so I'm going to get ready. So for example, okay, you're looking outside, it's cold, you're getting ready to go outside, and maybe you haven't even gone outside yet, and you start to shiver. Or maybe you just, have just stepped outside and you start to shiver. Okay, your body temperature has not dropped yet, but you start to shiver already, okay, because your body's like, I know I'm gonna drop my body temperature because it's really cold out, so I better start shivering early and get ready because I know it's gonna drop. Okay, so that would be feed-forward regulation. Okay, so it's just anticipating a change and kind of getting ready early.